If there's something missing from AAA gaming nowadays, it's a little bit of ambition, a little bit of risk, and a willingness to make the player feel uncomfortable, to trust the player with difficult ideas and not offer simple answers. All at the same time, risking falling flat on your face and failing. And that's why I have to heap some lavish praise on Cronos: The New Dawn. It's not without its flaws, but Bloober Team have delivered a claustrophobic setting, a tense and wonderfully calibrated resource economy, and a narrative that isn't content with simple answers. Instead, it explores the tension between individual freedom and the needs of wider society, challenging whether obedience is always the moral choice or whether the greatest failures come from following orders without question. With Cronos: The New Dawn, Bloober Team have dared to go where so many of its predecessors wouldn't have even tried. And even though there is a little bit of turbulence and a few bumps along the way, I still respect the hell out of them for even trying. It's easy and a bit reductive to cast off Cronos: The New Dawn as a Dead Space clone. The tight over-the-shoulder camera, the industrial horror and the body horror, disposing of bodies or body parts, and even the stomp on the floor, which is eerily reminiscent of the Dead Space stomp. The inspiration, I guess, couldn't be more obvious, but I think stopping there completely misses the point of why this game deserves to be talked about, because borrowing some mechanics isn't the same thing as borrowing ideas, and it's the ideas that make Cronos one of the most interesting survival horror games in a few years. Before we even get to the story, Cronos understands something many modern horror games have forgotten. Survival horror isn't really about horror. Well, it is, but it's also about scarcity. Every missed bullet matters, every healing item matters, every scrap of metal or resource needed to craft is important. It's a little bit of a lifeline for the next encounter, for the next room. And I think a good horror game makes you feel the pain of missing a bullet, missing a shotgun shot, just because you know how much it took to get those bullets. Combat isn't just about feeling powerful, though a power curve is important. Keeping the vulnerability in the player is also important. It's also about positioning, repositioning, staggering, retreating, and desperately trying not to waste ammunition while keeping your health up. And then thrown into this almost classic survival horror gameplay mix, which really does feel like old school Resident Evil, like Resident Evil 1 for example, where you didn't have a parry or a load of ammunition. But then add to that as well, Bloober Team's mechanic here of burning the bodies to stop merging and more unmerging later. Suddenly every encounter becomes a serious form of resource calculation. Do I sacrifice the resources now to stop a tougher encounter in the future when these enemies merge? Or can I afford to take the risk that maybe I don't revisit this room and the merging never happens? I really think it's this little tweak that just makes Cronos so on the edge of your seat. You're always trying to balance these decisions in your brain, and due to all of this kind of mental and resource gymnastics, the gameplay never gets old and it never gets stale. Add to that the feeling of heaviness, the weight to the movement, and the way you move kind of through the environment and under objects and jump onto things. It really adds to your feeling of vulnerability in the sense that you're not actually that fast. The thud of the suit, the feeling of restricted movement is fed back really well to the player and further makes you feel a little bit vulnerable to things that could close the space on you. I will say, however, the puzzles here are never too complex, using a kind of time warp mechanic to build and break surroundings around you and to use them to traverse through buildings. There's nothing here that really goes any further than reshape a few buildings, find a fuse or an electrical socket and pop it into a box. But outside of that though, I find it incredible that they managed to keep this combat and this gameplay loop feeling so fresh over the full playthrough, despite the fact that you could argue it's a little bit of a bare bones combat system when you compare it to, let's say, the evolution of recent Resident Evils. And one of the main reasons for that is the excellent resource economy. For me, one of the best things about survival horror is that feeling of tension and fear. And one of the core components of that fear is resource scarcity. And in Cronos, resource scarcity is, if not its beating heart, the very blood running through its veins. A true survival horror game needs to have a scavenger-esque element, so it feels like a genuine battle to survive. Constant lingering feeling of fear should be earned, not by jump scares, of which there are one too many for my liking towards the back end of Cronos: The New Dawn, and I can't let it off the hook for that because I gave the same criticisms to Alan Wake. And again, Alan Wake was another game that didn't need cheap jump scares. It had fear and intimidation oozing through its pores, but for some reason they leaned into these cheap jump scares, and they do the same here towards the back end, and it doesn't need it. But moving away from that, Cronos, like Alan Wake, has this constant feeling that you're kind of one bad decision away from a bad encounter. And Bloober Team via Cronos have really nailed that. You genuinely celebrate finding a handful of crafting resources or ammunition from smashing a few crates, and you feel a little disappointment or like, damn, when you don't get anything from a crate. I think that is a sign of good design. I've seen reviewers complain about the lack of inventory space. I think the lack of inventory space is one thing that really sets Cronos apart. Carrying around your bolt cutters in one of these valued inventory spaces to then open up extra rooms for extra crafting, it's a choice, a conscious choice the player has to make. You're basically gambling that the rewards behind these locked doors will outweigh the cost of using those bolt cutters in your inventory space. And that is something that is there for the whole game. And the lack of map as well. I love the lack of map here. You have to learn where you've left materials. You have to remember where the bodies are by understanding your environment. You learn the world, you search the shelves, you remember the rooms. You second guess if you've missed something or not looked properly at a shelf. Observation becomes survival. And also you can pet cats for free upgrades, and that is of course 10 out of 10. The level design also is brilliant, it's interconnected, it's a real city, it's a real industrial city that's interconnected via offices and rooms and corridors and lifts. These are tightly knitted levels, and having a carefully balanced risk-reward to exploration further reinforces the superb resource economy. This isn't a tough game in the traditional sense, it's a tough game in the sense of managing resources and constantly keeping an eye on what you have, where you've left stuff, and how to get back to it. But this is without a doubt one of the best and most finely tuned resource economies in any survival horror game ever. Visually, I think Bloober Team have become incredibly confident storytellers. The camera constantly shifts perspective. Darkness hides as much as it reveals. Harsh lighting gives everything this kind of grimy, B-movie, science fiction atmosphere. It feels extremely cinematic, and at times there really is a cinema quality element to the positioning of the camera in cutscenes. We often praise games for having good graphics, but graphics and cinematography aren't the same thing, and here Bloober Team have managed to blend both of them. Bloober Team do a really good job of understanding that where you place a camera in a cutscene really changes how a scene feels to the player, and due to the more grounded, realistic and serious tone of the story, those camera angles really work. Sometimes it's low to the ground, making the world tower over you. Sometimes it's high above you, making you feel like you are kind of looking down as a god, or maybe looking down as part of the collective on the traveler. Other times it sits awkwardly off center, letting the world be larger than the character, and sometimes the character is significantly larger than the world. Harsh shadows and darkness swallow entire rooms, and even like little conversations between characters, they feel uneasy because of how they're framed. I think they've learned a lot here from Silent Hill 2, and you can definitely feel that the magic of Silent Hill 2 and being involved with that project has rubbed off on Cronos: The New Dawn. Unlike, say, games like Resident Evil, where cutscenes are kind of exhibitions of the kind of campy horror that Resident Evil is known for, here the cutscenes are used to really push the idea of a lingering evil, push the idea of fear on the player, further enforce the idea of a psychological horror. Because when your story, as it is here, is built around identity, memory, collectivism, individuality and psychological horror, the way you frame a scene becomes just as important as the dialogue and the horror that you play. And another thing that plays a big role is the setting. Set in an alternative vision of 1980s Poland, inspired by real-life events such as the lockdown in 1981, and also living beneath the psychological shadow of the Cold War. And though Bloober Team have denied the story is COVID-inspired, the loss of freedom due to a disease that kills thousands of people seems eerily familiar. But whether you know your history or not, decades of books, films and documentaries have conditioned us to associate this era with surveillance, conformity, authority, and the fear of losing yourself to something bigger. And that makes it the perfect backdrop for the questions Cronos wants to ask. Not because it's making a political statement. Outside of the symbology that they show in the cutscenes, there's nothing political about Cronos. It is more ideological. But they do understand that this period of time has become symbolic of a timeless human fear of oppressive regimes, and how much of yourself would you surrender to those regimes for, in inverted commas, safety? And what if your safety entitles sacrificing a few others? And the story is really where Cronos separates itself from almost every other survival horror game, because beneath the monsters, it's really arguing about what it means to be human. The story isn't interested in easy heroes or villains, it's interested in arguing and debating an idea. Is one life worth sacrificing to save thousands? At what point do people stop becoming individuals and start becoming resources to further enhance the collective? Is humanity defined by our bodies, our memories, our choices, or simply by our ability to remain ourselves and remain true to ourselves? Even the act of these monsters merging is a sign of a loss of individuality. These monsters go from being themselves to merging into something bigger and more together. Individually, people literally disappear into one collective mass as these monsters merge with one another. Even the traveler doesn't have a name, just a number. Identity disappears, names disappear, and even in the choices you make as you collect people's essences, aka their souls, you can only have 3 at any one time, so you're constantly asked, not what can I afford to lose, but who can I afford to lose? And I feel every major force in Cronos really asks, are any of these any good when pushed to the extreme? The collective believes humanity matters more than any one person. The Pathfinder believes one person can matter more than the cause of the greater good. The change erases individuality entirely, but what can we sacrifice to beat the change, or to at least mitigate its effects? Nobody is completely right and nobody is completely wrong. Every belief on this planet becomes dangerous once it's pushed to its absolute extreme. That's what makes the writing here so interesting. It's not preachy at all, it's simply asking, and it doesn't give you any simple answers. Cronos isn't without its flaws. The boss fights have way too many glowing weak points. Fire is a mechanic used throughout the whole game, and because it leans so heavily into symbolism and ideology, there were definitely large stretches of the game where the game felt so ambiguous that you were kind of lost a little bit. Also, that flaw in itself is one of the reasons I kind of respect Cronos. Bloober Team weren't aiming for another straightforward evil corporation story. They're trying to build something more philosophical, more cerebral, more ambiguous, more uncomfortable. And sometimes in this story they do miss and they are a bit too ambiguous and you're kind of left scratching your head. But like I said at the start, at least Bloober Team aimed high. And yes, they took a risk, but in my opinion, that risk paid off and they deserve a lot of love. But I think at the core of any great piece of art is the feeling it leaves with you after the credits roll, a day or weeks later. And Cronos asks some really big questions. Is humanity worth preserving? If preserving it means sacrificing the people you love. A common question or discussion that comes up with a lot of friends I know who work in the medical industry is when talking about the COVID vaccine and how the COVID vaccine sadly did lead to some deaths of some people, and whether or not that is worth it or was worth it to get the whole world going again, to make everyone safe. And let's just park conspiracy theories about vaccines for a minute. That's generally the core question here at the core of Cronos. Are a handful of people dying a worthy sacrifice to save the rest of society? And obviously your opinion is different on if the people who died were the people you loved. There isn't a clean answer, and there probably shouldn't be, because Cronos isn't really asking you to choose between a good ending and a bad ending. It's asking you which decision you can live with, and that's why I will remember it. Up there with other great endings in video games. I absolutely loved it, not because it's flawless, but because it has the courage to chase something bigger in an industry increasingly obsessed with safe sequels, familiar formulas and predictable stories. I'll always have more respect for the game that dared to reach for significance. Even if at times it lost its way, eventually I think Cronos ended somewhere a little bit profound. Cronos The New Dawn isn't memorable because it's perfect, it's memorable because it was brave enough to shoot for the moon. Thank you so much, that's my Cronos video. I absolutely loved Cronos. An incredible effort by Bloober Team, and I hope they get another chance to stretch their creative muscle in their own direction and not just focus on remakes. Peace, take care, like and subscribe. Thank you.